Hello and welcome to the Inspire online book club for June. This month we're talking about The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste, and I'm joined today by I think a bigger cohort of public readers than we've had for a while, which is brilliant. We've got Anne, Col, Terri and Claire, and I'm also joined by my colleague Michelle from Inspire. So welcome everybody, thank you for joining us. We've just been having a quick chat about the book, and during that time it became obvious that there is so much to talk about, so I'm going to give an absolutely whistle-stop introduction to it just so that we know the basic setting. So Mengiste is an Ethiopian American writer, and she's focused on a conflict which was this, I think it got a line in a GCSE textbook, the Abyssinian Conflict, when I was learning about the Second World War, but I knew very little else about it. And it takes place during the mid-1930s. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, is in exile in England. And Italy, particularly Mussolini, is continuing its empire building in the East Africa area and invades Ethiopia. So in the emperor's absence, the army obviously mobilizes, but also so do many townspeople and village people. And in this story, as it turns out, also some women followed the men, not only to cook, clean and look after people in the makeshift hospitals, but also some of them ended up fighting. The story focuses on a young woman called Hirut. When the book begins, she's in quite a domestic setting. She's in a position of servitude, although she looks back to a life of happiness with her parents who are now dead. And very quickly, it becomes a much more wide and panoramic picture as the invasion starts, the mobilization begins, and Hirut begins to find a new role in her life. We also meet some people from the Italian side, who I'm afraid don't get a great press in this book, largely the military commanders, but also a young man called Ettore, who is a photographer and is essentially forced to record some absolutely appalling cruelty that is meted out upon the captured Abyssinians. I should say Abyssinians and Ethiopians, the word changes within the book. Abyssinia is the historic name for Ethiopia, as we call it now. And eventually Hirut and Ettore, their stories meet. So that's an absolute whistle stop, which doesn't give you any idea of the complexity and the breadth of this novel. And so I think it would be quite good to start with that notion of the history, about how much we knew about it and how much we know about it having read the book. So Col, would you like to start us off talking about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. My knowledge of history is pretty poor, to say the least. And initially, I was a little bit puzzled as to why Italy should invade Ethiopia, because a quick look on a map showed that they are not neighbours. Traditionally, countries invade their neighbours. So I had to read other material about the not just the 1935 invasion, but the 1896 one. And I found out that Italy colonised part of Somalia and the whole of Eritrea. So effectively, Italy became Ethiopia's neighbours on two fronts. So once I got that in my head, it kind of made a little bit more sense. So I think maybe a note by way of an introduction at the start of the novel would have helped me and possibly a lot of other people.
Yeah, there was no context given, was there? Claire, you
No,
mentioned something similar. Did you feel that the historical context was not set well enough, or meant that you had to do further research rather than just read the book?
You definitely have to do further research because obviously the Italians were in Libya as well, which I was aware of because I lived in there in the early 60s. However, that if you know that, you actually know why the war actually ended in 1942, because in fact we were fighting up in Tobruk and places like that. So the Italians couldn't actually keep control of Ethiopia. They just overextended themselves, which is why they got out. And the other thing that I found particularly fascinating was the fact that there was still slavery in Ethiopia at that time. And I had to look to find out that they didn't actually abolish slavery till after the Italians left, because the Italians were actually using that as an excuse to go into Ethiopia. They were actually saying, look, we're going to sort Ethiopia out, modernise it, get rid of these practices.
Mm.
So I think that there should have been definitely some sort of historical context put in. It explains a lot more about what's actually going on and how the book finished.
Okay.
And also looking further afield to why Harut was actually going when she did, because that was the point at which Haile Selassie sort of ended his reign, and what they've got now, because I didn't really know much about how Ethiopia is now, what sort of government it's got or anything.
Yeah. But I suppose in some ways using a novel as a platform for further reading, I don't mind. In fact, it's quite exciting, it's quite interesting to do that, but at the same time setting the context might have made us just feel that we were a little bit better informed when we began, because it's such an unknown area. Terri, what did you think about the fictionalization of that element of history? Because I've heard Mengiste talk about it, and she says they're all made up, apart from the central characters. You know, there's Haile Selassie and the various Mussolini is referred to. Everybody, Harut and Aster and Kidani, the family that she's with, and Ettore are made up figures. What do you feel about that approach to taking this element of taking an element of history and utterly fictionalizing it?
I don't have a problem with that. Like everyone else, then I needed to conduct some research into the actual history of it. But I think that the way that the author portrays the contrast between two sides, the sheer power of the Italian army, their communications, their radios, their tanks, and so on, against Kidani's army, with only ancient rifles and so on and so forth. So it does show how the weaker side, and in fact, using their skill and then their knowledge of their environment, how they can actually become the successors, the victorious warriors as such.
Yes, it was. They seemed. A lot was made of that. There was a lot of detail, wasn't there? And you did see this 20th century machinery, and as you say, telegraphing and so on, and young children running to take messages on the Ethiopian side, and this absolute disparity between them. In terms of our sympathies, thinking about the actual characters she picks out, Anne, did you feel that we got to know Harut, and did you like her as a character?
I think we got to know her to an extent. I didn't actually sympathise with any of the characters, really, which is one of the things I found difficult in the book. I like to have somebody to sympathise with. I mean, she obviously, you were intended to, and there was a lot about her that drew one's sympathy, but somehow, I don't know, it didn't quite come off for me. I mean, I think it might be part related to my struggles with the structure of the book. I don't know if you want me to mention this, which is the way it was written. Well, there were two things I think I found difficult. One was the fact that when the author doesn't use any speech marks at all. So not only, I mean, sometimes we've got somebody said and then you don't really read it, but a lot of the time you don't. I found that difficult because you weren't always sure who was speaking or whether they were speaking or thinking or quite how it was. Okay. And the other thing was, of course, there was quite a bit of use, quite reasonably, of other languages, quite a bit of Italian and of and I can't remember what it's called now, the Ethiopian language begins with A. And so you had to work out what this meant. And that was another challenge. So I think between these two structural things to do with the way the book was written, that reduced my ability to be as sympathetic as I might otherwise have been. But that's perhaps just my failings.
Well, no, your opinion. That's fine. Michelle, you were talking earlier about your thoughts on the way that she uses language and that kind of stream of consciousness. Were you happier about it, or do you agree with Anne that it was?
Yeah, I actually enjoyed that about it, the lack of punctuation, which I thought I'd never say, but for me it actually helped me be inside Harut's mind, for me. And I find myself, I just think it's a difference in how different people read, which is interesting in itself. For me, it helped the story flow, and I felt a little bit more like I was inside that character's mind. I mean, because it is beautiful writing, regardless of punctuation or not. It is absolutely beautiful writing.
I mean, I felt some of the time that it was easier to sort of view it as poetry and read it in that way, and it was better. But it wasn't poetry, and it was a sort of structured novel. So there's a bit of a
it wasn't very lyrical, was it? It wasn't lyrical in the way that poetry. It was very specific and very precise, as well as being sort of stream of consciousness, which I have to say I didn't mind that, and in fact I hadn't really noticed it until Michelle mentioned it and said, "Oh, I don't mind about. I'm okay without having speech marks." I mean, I have read quite a lot of novels which are like that. Some of which have not. It's not paid off. But I felt there was an epic sweep to it, wasn't there? And she does talk about it. The Greeks. She went back to the Greeks because there is something hugely epic about these battles and these passionate characters and so on. And she has people like the chorus emerging, and she has epilogues and prologues and so on. Those bits I didn't like as much. I thought it's not a drama in that way. So why are you having to have a chorus? Why couldn't it just be the narrator or a passive voice? So I felt that was something that was maybe getting in the way of the narrative, which in other respects I did felt flowed.
Yeah, I think when we got Haile Selassie, seeing ghosts and operatic characters, I think that was a little
the whole
bit too
Aida
much
thing
for
was
me.
a bit
That's the one.
Yes.
That bit seemed to come out of it for me. That bit towards the end seemed to come out of left field, really.
For me too.
Jarred a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, it might have been a bit research heavy. There were a couple of times a character arrived and then disappeared quite quickly and wasn't very significant. And you were thinking, oh, I think maybe this is someone that the writer has come across in her research. There was a slave owner who wanted to buy Hirut, wasn't there? There was a guy that wanted to buy her, and the cook, who was a rather interesting character, says, no, take me instead. And that I thought that character was going to be significant because he arrived. And we knew a lot about him, and he seemed to have quite a charismatic attitude. And then we never heard about him again. He just disappeared. So in a book that big, you can't really afford to do that. I think you have to say, no, let's focus on what we need to focus on. So there were a couple of moments there where maybe she'd heard a story that she thought was too good to leave out. What do we think? Obviously, it's the plight of the women in the book is very central. And in what I did like, I'm sorry, I'm sort of going off on a tangent, that when we first meet Hirut, we really don't like Asta, her mistress, who is cruel and capricious and violent. And Kidani seems to be protecting Hirut, and he calls her little one, and he seems to be keeping an eye out for her. That changes dramatically, and he behaves appallingly. And so I liked the fact that the characters weren't just good or bad. And I wonder if this is why, Anne, you didn't say you liked anyone, because they are so complex and so human. And there isn't a goodie and a baddie, and everyone makes, they all have moral compromises, and someone can be a hero and an abuser, depending on who's looking. So I thought that was a quite a sophisticated element.
Yeah, for me, certainly, I mean, the cook was basically a slave who was brought to Kidana's home against her wishes. Hirut was brought to Kidana's home because both her parents were killed, and they lived in a shack made of straw and animal dung, with barely enough space for either of them. And at first, you look at Astaire, and she's the lady of the house, and she's got the finery and the status. But then as the book goes on, you realise that she's just as much a captive as the other two women, because she was brought to Kidana's house as a result of an arranged marriage, and she was raped on her wedding night. And I think Astaire was just as much a captive as the cook or Hirut.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think those, and I wonder if that's in any way can explain why they would be so prepared to go into battle and so supportive of it. Terri, have you got any thoughts on that, about how those women who were servants or the mistress of servants, how someone like that could actually say, no, I'm going to be a warrior. Because Asta takes it on immediately, doesn't she? As soon as she hears about the invasion, she grasps that opportunity.
And I think that's her opportunity to escape, or almost from being imprisoned with Kidane. And, you know, Hirut as well, we see her as this poor little orphan. And then suddenly, you know, she's a warrior racing across the scrubland. And and then the chorus comes in, and you know, it's almost like an encore at the opera, isn't it?
Yes.
They're celebrating her huge courage. So I think there are, along with the contrasts, there are the contrasts within the characters, how they're all transformed. And Cook, for instance, no name, because when she was stolen as a child, she refused to give her name. So for me, it's quite remarkable that her and Minim's name means nothing. Yes. You know, they rise as the most victorious and two of the most powerful characters, really.
Yes, very.
But this transformation, this transformation would be temporary, wouldn't it? Because as soon as the war ended,
oh yes,
I just got this overwhelming feeling that they would be back to living a life of slavery. And yeah. I think all for me, all the characters were mired in their own misery to some extent, and there was it just seemed to be a sea of futility. You just knew that whichever way the war was going to end, life wasn't going to get better for these people.
No,
in my view. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think perhaps writing themselves in history, so those songs are made about Asta. That's what she's done. That's all she can do. And so she's made herself a hero, so that at least that will remain of her, even though everything else will become effaced as whatever else will happen to her. Claire, what did you feel about that the rise of the women into war? Did you feel that was something that was dealt with sensitively and realistically?
Well, I find it fascinating that the women sort of were supposed to come along and do the washing and the cooking for the men, and it reminded me of the sort of Napoleonic Wars, where you saw the women. They often brought their women with them to do the washing and the cooking, and they were sort of behind the lines. And I think actually the women were supposed to stay behind the lines, but they didn't, did they? In the end, they somehow seized the opportunity to do something more, because that's what normally after the war they just go back to the washing and the cooking, but actually the war gave them an opportunity to do something else. And I think that in itself is interesting, that there's this, we've got to bring the women along because we need them to do this job. And in fact, they ended up doing something else.
Yes, perhaps, and that was their only agency, wasn't there? I mean, Michelle, I think you were saying something about why you thought it was very believable when we were talking earlier about Hirut and Asta wanting to fight. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it was Cole that said just before we started about it is extraordinary that these women that are so abused by the men around him, such as Kidane, then go and stand and fight with him. But for me, I mean, that made me sit back and pause, but for me, it was their ultimate act of rebellion. You know, that's it, that he didn't want them to fight. He didn't want women to have that place. And they've got all this anger inside them that they had to keep so buried, going through all this abuse, and that's where they put it. They was actually rebelling against Kidane while standing beside him in battle and letting all their anger out. And
that's part of the complexity, isn't it? I think it wasn't an act of solidarity with him, it was an act of agency for them. And shadows, we should mention shadows, because it is called the Shadow King, and Terri's already mentioned the fact that there is this Shadow King a young man called Minim who looks like Haile Selassie, who is trained to appear on horseback and seem to be him, because there's a desire for the Italians to believe that the emperor has returned and will be leading the army. Not that they ever really believe it at all, do they? But it helps give the troops some kind of faith and some hope in the future as well. But everyone else seems to, the shadow motif seems to permeate the book. Excuse me. Sorry. So as well as the Shadow King, lots of people seem to be shadows of themselves. So there's the shadow and darkness in Ettore's photography. Anne, was that something that struck you when you were reading it? Were you aware of this, the fact that there are all sorts of shadowy figures standing behind and old photographs and so on? Was that something that added to the mood for you?
Yes, I think it does add to the mood. Yes, I mean, I think there's lots of symbolism, like the gun, the gun that's so important to Herut, but yet when Herut, whoever soldier it's given to, it doesn't fire. So it's,
yes,
I think there's these kind of symbolic aspects, and there's a lot of symbolism in what the cook does, which is quite interesting. It's also interesting that she never has a name at all.
Yes.
She's just a cook.
Again, that's the only thing she's got for herself, isn't it, I suppose? And there's this framing reference. So I said it starts off domestically, but actually it starts off with Herut going to a station with a box of photographs, and then at the end, Ettore comes to reclaim his photographs. And I thought their relationship, such as it was again extremely tricky, because Herut hates him, and at one point he tries to show her a photograph he's taken of her when she's been prisoner, and she's partly stripped and she's standing there, and he sees the photograph as her being proud and defiant, whereas when he shows it to her, she wants to go, why are you showing me a picture of me being humiliated? And so again, the double meanings and the shadow meanings behind everything seem to come out in that relationship, which never really develops, but is again a symbolic relationship. Does anyone else want to add anything else? Because we've touched upon quite a lot of the book, but yeah, Col, have you got anything else?
Yeah, I was talking earlier about the background reading I had to undertake because my knowledge of history is terrible, and I think the book, obviously, it's because of the author's Ethiopian background, can give the impression that it's the nasty Italians are against the innocent and righteous Ethiopians, and that wasn't the case. I mean, both sides were guilty of war crimes. I take Terri's point that the Italians had the superiority with tanks and armour and planes and what have you, but the Ethiopians they used dum-dum bullets, which expand on impact, creating larger wounds, and they were banned by the Hague Convention, so they shouldn't have been using those. And they mutilated and castrated a lot of the prisoners, and castrated a lot of the Italians dead.
Yeah.
So
I mean, war crimes were undoubtedly committed on both sides. I suppose that the central invasion itself was unforgivable, and also if you read France in particular, and other European countries that should have really been saying to Italy, leave them alone, wouldn't, because they wanted to try and get them aligned in the lead up to the war. So a lot of Europe turned its head the other way and allowed Italy to. They were essentially empire building, weren't they? But within that, the war was a dirty war. I think Mengiste says, war creates chaos, which then becomes an opportunity for change. But from what we're saying, the chaos means that people are, it's the thing about people not being good or bad. There were undoubtedly appalling things on both sides, but as you say, she has chosen to focus very much.
Yes, there's no mention of the war crimes committed by Ethiopia. No. And I think the fact that all the characters were capable of extreme acts of cruelty made it difficult for me to like any of them. In the end, the only character I cared for was Ettore, the photographer.
Yeah.
Because,
What did anyone else think about Ettore?
I wanted to know more about him, because I know at the end of the war he didn't go back to Italy, did he? He went off because he was Jewish and he couldn't go back at the time, because don't forget the war there ended in 1942, but of course at that time, you had the Germans going into Italy and taking away the Jews from Italy.
Yeah.
So he couldn't go back there. So I wanted to know where he wandered to. It does vaguely mention some of the places, but it doesn't really explain that. And I want to know a bit more about his story.
He's in
and what he
exile,
actually
isn't he?
did.
He's exiled after that. I mean, I
He's
thought
exiled, but we don't know much about what happened to him. And
he's shadowy.
that's the story.
He's shadowy.
Again.
One of those figures. Terri or Anne, did you have thoughts about Ettore? Did you think he provided a counterpoint, or do you think he was sympathetic?
I don't know. I mean, you're sort of led to feel that he is. You might be more sympathetic to him, that he's a sort of better person than some of the others. But then, although he doesn't really do any terrible things, he's very complicit in them because he's photographing them. So you can't absolve him really when he's there quite specifically photographing all the people being pushed off the cliff and lots of other things as well.
Yeah. That's why I felt sorry for him. That's why I felt sorry for him, because he didn't have any option. In my view, he had to take the photographs, and at the same time, the people that he was taking the photographs for were getting rid of his parents because they were Jewish as well. So he was in an impossible situation, I think.
Yeah, Terri,
I agree with. Oh, sorry.
Can we just do? I'll go to Terri first.
Well, he was hired as a war photographer, and I think he went into that quite blindly, perhaps not realizing, just how gory some of the photographs needed to be to please Fucelli, the colonel. But then there were parts where I felt that his approach to taking the photographs was quite perverse. Tariku, the hanging boy, he took photographs of him from different angles, trying to get the light right. So, for me, a simple photograph to please Fucelli would have been quite sufficient. So I think at one point but perhaps it was his mental state, trying to distance himself from the horror of it all. His mind was focusing on light and shadow without really appreciating the fact that, this is a human being hanging here.
Looking at it artistically, and yes, just looking at what surrounded it rather than the central figure, and perhaps that was his having to be remote in that way. But that did make him seem callous, I suppose. But it may have been a self-protection. Yes, I think we've got about another minute or two. If anyone wants to raise anything else that we won't have to talk about at length, which is a real problem with this book because it's so rich.
There is so much that you could talk about within it, isn't it? I mean, I think my thing was how it really showed that how important fiction can be in telling real stories, because I think a lot of us have said, Col said the same, I didn't know much about this at all, and I have Google has been my friend during reading this novel, but I wouldn't have known all these things. And even so, even somebody that had read it in actual in factual books, they wouldn't have known these stories of the women, and I just think that's such an important role that probably fiction can only do.
I think she's mentioned that. There was I think Camilla Shamsi mentioned something about this and she was one of the judges of the Booker Prize, and I read a quick interview where she was talking about it, but she was referring to that need to find truth through fiction, and it reminded me of something that Hilary Mantel had said in an interview that I heard quite recently on the radio. I think that she was saying history books are fiction. Everything, because every fact has been filtered through somebody's eyes. They've been subjective. They might be politically motivated, or they might be politically manipulated, or they might have been created. History is created from gossip, from hearsay, from they said that's what he did, and the loudest voice. The further back you go, it's the loudest voice you hear, which isn't necessarily the true voice. And so she said history is fiction as well. making a fiction out of historical things is another way to finding the truth. So obviously she was talking about Thomas Cromwell, but it chimed reading this book because she'd taken the bare bones and then fleshed them out with characters that were invented and situations that were invented. But as Col was saying, you read something else and there's another slant on it. So there is no one truth. There are interpretations and there are impressions that one gets, but you can't say this is the fact and this is completely made up. There is some point in the middle where those two things meet, and I think this book seems to do that. Right, I think we'll call it a day there. Really interesting conversation. Thank you very much to everybody, and to everyone listening to this. Please do get involved. Look up on the Inspire website about being involved in the book club, and we're also going to be doing some more interactive stuff that you might be able to get involved with as well. So do watch this space. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next month. Bye bye.